Thank you for having me. Thank you, Stephen, for doggedly trying to get me for the last several years and inviting me again. The climate panel last night was really interesting. I don't know how many of you got to see it. It was, I learned so much and took so many notes. I'm still recovering, however, from those lima beans last night. I don't know if I'm the only one. Those were interesting. I am a writer. I'm a storyteller. I'm a truth seeker, like many of you. I'm a person who's invested in the bittersweet contradictions of beauty and pain in the world that we're living in today. I did not begin this book as an activist by any stretch. I didn't have an agenda. I managed with this book to piss off both the pro-GMO people and the anti-GMO people because I walked a middle line and interviewed everybody on all sides. I love that Stephen mentioned how accessible my book is, and I think it is. I took 5.5 years to work on it. And the reason I took that time is because I'm also a mom, and I wanted to get it right. And there was a part of me that really resisted writing this book. When I first started it, I was assigned a piece by the New York Times Magazine about GMOs and GMO corn in particular, and the environmental impact of them, but also how laden they were with pesticides and the pesticidal action that is bred inside of them. And then the piece was going to have too long a time frame before it came out, so I ended up walking it over to Elle magazine, and that's where it came out as The Bad Seed, which became a viral sensation and put me on the hit list for pretty much all the henchmen from Big Ag. And from there, editors started calling me and asking me if I wanted to write a book. I was reluctant, and here's why. As I was doing the research, even for the 2.5 years before that piece came out in Elle, and before anyone asked me to write a book, I felt like I was sort of looking into this dark, dingy cupboard, and what was in there was our food system and the broken problems of our food system. And every time I would peer in there, I would slam the door and think, no, this is not for me. This is for, Michael Pollan, somebody who's got a staff. This is not for a mother living in Maine with 2 children and no money and no science background. So but there was something about it that continued to, the pink water bottle. You should all carry your own stainless steel water bottle. There's one thing you take home from this conference. But anyway, so I kept coming back to it because selfishly I wanted to learn more about what was happening with our environment and what was happening with our food. I wanted the information for myself and for my children, and there were just things that just weren't lining up that I would learn, and then I'd want to find out more, and I'd do another interview, and I'd discover that somebody was not really telling me the whole truth, or would say something that really sort of was incendiary, and then I'd want to learn more. So that's how I got on this whole track. But I love that Stephen said, to bring this back around, that it's an accessible book. For me, I had in my mind's eye a mom at the beach reading this book. She was my person. I had a very specific image of my reader. And she's got children who are coming in and out of the water, not so young they're going to drown, children, 10 years old or something. And she's putting sunblock on them and feeding them snacks and giving them water. But what I wanted her to be able to do was to pick my book back up and not have to get a PhD in the meantime. And like a Tom Clancy novel or something else, she could leave off in the middle of a sentence and then come back to it. And I'm told, anyway, that I succeeded, that the book is a page-turner, very easy to understand. It was the first mainstream, it came out in 2016, so over 2 years ago now. It was the first mainstream book about this topic. And And the book works very hard to be as mainstream as possible and to really break things down. So doing this book really turned me into an environmentalist. And how could it not? I felt like as I was doing the research, my heart broke for our children, for the voiceless birds, animals, plants, the soil, air, and water that we all need as I was working on it. I drove by myself across the Great Plains and interviewed Monsanto people and seed scientists and activists. And then I went to Europe and I hung out with beekeepers and I studied bees and honey. And I traveled with beekeepers around Germany. And then the last section of the book is about Oaxaca and how the native corn from our seed of agriculture, of corn agriculture, got contaminated with US grown corn. It was an exciting book to write. It was a real journey. I was often the only woman in the room, so I write about that a lot, being a woman and doing this. People didn't always treat me well. And at the same time, it was a real adventure, and it was very exciting to do. So what I thought I would do today, all that being said, is to take a second here, and I'd like to read you an essay that I wrote that I think encapsulates some of the issues I'm thinking about right now. And then we can come back to the book and talk about that. So let me pull that out. So this is an essay I wrote a year ago, and it's called Finding Garden Grace in Dark Times. The path from our house to the garden went through a small copse of trees, mostly fir and white pines as I remember it, and the ground was covered with their reddish-brown needles, soft and springy under my bare feet. Along the edges of the path, wintergreen grew, and I would squat to pluck the fragrant bitter leaves and the more subtly minty berries from the low plants, popping them into my mouth. My destination was my parents' garden, but the journey was ritualistic. Inside that little soft and fragrant enclave, I felt my soul, to borrow from Zora Neale Hurston, crawl out from its hiding place. Once in the garden, 2 big rectangular plots dug into the earth, I was surrounded by a veritable cornucopia. Depending on the time of year, I remember potatoes and squashes, cabbages and carrots, kale and corn. Not far from the garden, we raised chickens. Beyond those, we had red maples that we tapped every spring, hauling the sap to our sugar shack, where we boiled it down for syrup, our main sweet. We had a root cellar closer to the house, dug deep into the pungent clay-infused earth, where we stored everything that could make it through the winter. The outside of the cabbages, I remember, would become slimy, but their accordion flesh inside would remain fresh. By March, the carrots were shriveled at their points. Snakes and bugs hid in the grasses around the sides of the garden. Today, many years later, whenever I think of it, I see my father standing in that Eden, his jeans muddied in dry, round drying patches at the knees, and he's leaning on a shovel and talking to me, his brow sweaty, while all around him plants flourish. Back then, this scene was not only emblematic of purity, it was the literal embodiment of it. This is what my parents had sought, after all, a refuge from the politics of the Vietnam War and all the trappings of an American culture that was, in their view, destructive to themselves, to their children, to other countries. The way they tell it, my mother wanted to move to Canada, but they ran out of steam in Maine. It seemed far enough. They were romanced by the beauty and majesty of our coast, so they stopped and bought 60 acres with a small timber house on the coast for $7,000. There they began making a life for themselves and my brother Aaron and me, and there they started their careers as artists while learning how, over time, to connect to the land. I believe I can say with confidence that my parents weren't thinking about lead in the soil, or acid rain, or PCBs, or pesticides, or water purity, or climate change, or any need for raised beds. The gardens were far enough from the house that they could not be contaminated by lead paint chips, even if they had been thinking of this in 1970. These things didn't seem to directly affect us on our little patch of pristine earth far away from industry. Though they had both read Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which came out in 1962, almost a decade earlier, her work had only a distant resonance with what they were intentionally growing and building. Those dangers, the ones that she wrote about, were like theoretical. What they were building wouldn't yet be touched by her truths. Also, by August of 1974, when I came along, the war was ending. The civil rights movement had made significant changes. Neil Armstrong had walked on the moon, and my mother was holding me in a hospital bed while watching Nixon decamp from the White House. And although Carson had died by then, after an heroic battle with breast cancer, the country seemed to be changing in her wake. Programs aimed at protecting the natural resources and future generations were being put into place. DDT had been banned, the EPA formed, the first Earth Day celebrated, the Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Act both signed into law. Our government appeared to be listening, in a refreshing and democratic way, to its people and scientists. Looking back, I don't think I'm wearing rose-colored glasses when I say that the time of my childhood was just plain simpler. We kids played soccer in the same sneakers we'd worn all day in school. Cleats were not something we even thought about needing. We had fewer toys and stuff in general. I played with sticks and rocks and shells and dressed our dog Fiona up in hats, putting lipstick on her mouth when I was bored. And I had one doll, and still have it to this day. My mother made my friend Jennifer and me a big box of art supplies, the Jennifer and Caitlin box, filled with leftover scraps of mat board from my father's studio and pens and paper to create anything we wanted. Picking the bad ones out of the beans my mother needed to soak for tomorrow's dinner was a fun activity. And back then, I don't think I'm overstating it to say that the incredible power of industry and its insatiable thirst to pillage from nature had not yet gotten into full swing. It had not come home to us. Stuff was not suffocating every square inch of our indoor and outdoor space. Plastic hadn't taken over. Today, some 30 years later, I think about that time and my heart aches. And not just because we left that Eden when I was 7, a pain that still travels with me, or because my parents eventually divorced, and later, when I thought our family couldn't unravel any further, it did. But also because the dangers my parents thought were distant from their pristine lives on our homestead in Maine are not at all theoretical anymore. They are real, everywhere. Back when Carson wrote Silent Spring, she informed us that there were 500 new chemicals being churned out every year just in America. Today, that number is more like 800. And as time goes on, there are now 85,000 plus chemicals in circulation, just in this country alone. 85,000 chemicals, to which, as Carson so presciently wrote, the bodies of men and animals are required somehow to adapt each year. Chemicals totally outside the limit of biologic experience. Many of these chemicals are carcinogens, endocrine disruptors, or have antibiotic qualities. They have been scientifically proven to cause anything from damage to our microbiomes, to learning disabilities, to fetal brain damage, to cancer. It's no stretch today to say that there is truly no pure place anywhere anymore. Not even somewhere we can pretend at purity. No refuge. Our soil, rain, air, and water, pretty much everywhere, are contaminated to some degree with dangerous toxins being pumped out by industry at an alarming rate. Even if we're miles and miles from the nearest farm, town, or neighbor spraying pesticides, the clouds will deliver them to our organic gardens in the rain. Bees will carry neonicotinoids from a nursery's potted bushes to our own squash blossoms. Every river now delivers toxins downstream. Chemicals come to us in baby toys, household goods, cars, and plastic shopping bags. Flame retardants from our couches and mattresses now show up in harbor seals and birds across the globe. Toxins come to our kids' dinner plates, both as systemic pesticides grown inside as well as sprayed onto our food. They come in our water leached through the ground from our neighbors' lawns and septic systems or in public water supplies. As a mother of small children, I don't think I'm understating it when I say this all feels just impossible, like an unending exercise in futility, a labor against a tide of not only chemical but also spiritual contamination. I say spiritual because the question that takes my breath away is, who lets this happen? Well, us. We let it happen. And then, of course, there are the many other problems that are affecting young families like mine. A shrinking middle class, the incredible and expanding costs of healthcare, homes, food, and everyday needs, the not-so-existential seeming threats of nuclear war, terrorism, the list goes on. Obviously, that house for $7,000 my parents bought on the coast of Maine with 60 acres of safe and thick woods surrounding it, I can't possibly do that for my own kids. And yet, here's the thing. There is still a deep desire so many of us have to practice attachment and unconditional parenting, healing the wounds of our own childhoods, while at the same time trying to give our kids something better. So many of us work hard to eat locally and organically and to try to cook good meals, some of us from scratch. All while working our jobs, cleaning our houses, and ferrying children to and from piano and baseball and dance classes too. Many of us are trying to keep our kids from falling into the distraction pit of technology. I submit that it is an act of courage each day to get up, put one foot in front of the other, towards something we believe in, to become a boat against the current. It takes everyday heroics to focus on making our children feel safe, even if keeping them completely safe is increasingly elusive. And yet we do it. And it is in this human desire to make the world beautiful, as Barbara Cooney's inspiring children's book character, Miss Rumphius, instructs, that a truly transcendent grace comes to all of us parents. And it is in this grace that I find myself on an early May morning planting our raised beds. Now look, I'm not a very good gardener. I'm kind of embarrassed to admit this, truth be told, given that I come from back to the Lander parents. But the thing is, you're good at the things you practice. For the past few years, though, inspired by having children and my desire to give them something of what I came from, I've been digging into the soil that I have. Together, my children's small legs tangled around mine, their hands helpfully poised with watering cans that are somehow watering more me than the garden. The seeds come out, and hope rises inside of us. To be honest, the mystery of soil and water and feeding the plants is, as of yet, still a bit murky to me. More often than not, I find myself with a packet of seeds in one hand, Barbara Damrosch's garden primer in the other, and my smallest child making mud cakes at my feet, while I try to figure out how to make a cucumber mound work better this year. A few years ago, my father joked that what we had was a demonstration garden for my two young sons, then 1 and 7. In many ways, he's still right. I can't tell you how many mornings I stand out there staring at the plants, my eyes squinted. Is that a weed, I wonder, or a flower? How did those lettuce seeds get over there? And where did the carrots go? But the reason I do it is that I want my kids to see food. Food for us, food for the bees and hummingbirds being grown. I want us to behold together what really does feel like a real miracle when the plants first come up, when it begins to take form, when a cucumber first juts off a twisty stalk. I want my kids to feel when they pick that cucumber, the warm sun deep in its green, prickly skin, and the satisfaction when they eat it of knowing that they grew that cucumber themselves with little more than some soil, water, and sun, and in our case, some luck thrown in. It has occurred to me lately, as I grasp for good news, that this may be our most powerful defense against the darkness. Because it is in this brave step that we take charge of our food, of the lessons we are handing our children about where food comes from. And we are showing them that change can truly begin at home. In this one gesture, we are saying goodbye to plastic packaging, to the corporations that grow our food, to the chemical companies peddling 90% of the seeds available to the world, to the water-hogging fields in Mexico and California, to the seeds available to an agricultural system that is dangerously changing our climate, to decidedly undemocratic system that makes a few people very rich and most everyone else impoverished in some important way. We all can do this demonstration, of course. Many of you already do it. As you know, we can do it in our home gardens, in window boxes, in pots on our steps. We can do it in community gardens. Our gestures may be small, and we might need a good dose of luck to make anything come to fruition, but what we are doing is still a real and tangible bulwark against an avalanche of information coming across the wires telling us that we are powerless, that we are no longer able to make a good, clean, safe place in the world for our children and grandchildren. Hope, as the saying goes, springs eternal. To my mind, there's nothing more hopeful than a seed in the dark, loamy soil. I hold on to that small kernel. Even on a day like today, when the temperature hovers below 10 degrees, I hold on to it against the darkness, against the fear, and against the pessimism. So, thank you. So that's a little essay that I wrote that is sort of more contemporaneous to some of the things I'm thinking about right now. This book, as I told you, was a big journey, a huge learning curve for me. I had to learn a lot of science. I spoke with a lot of scientists. I often studied some little piece of science, and then I felt I had to learn kind of everything around it. So I would read one study, and I would read 25 or 30 studies surrounding that study, so that I could understand more about all the sort of tangential and random things that it made me think of, say, or all the different issues associated with that study. And then I had to kind of crunch it all down and figure out what would be important for me to learn and what would be important for someone else to learn. So that was the real work of writing the book. And, to go to the topic that Stephen mentioned about as we modify the environment, we modify ourselves. That's a line from my book. That is absolutely true. We are dangerously contaminating our soil, air, water. Our clouds carry pesticides from one place to the other. It's almost impossible to get anything that's entirely clean. The part of the reason I wrote the section on honey was that I thought of honey as this pure and iconic substance, and then to discover that honey carried so many contaminants and what was facing bees and how many ways they were being affected was a real education for me. I learned a lot about bees. And of course, this kind of, the kind of industrial agriculture that we're involved in. Last night in the climate panel, there was a lot of discussion about raising beef and raising jungle to plant GMO soybeans in order to raise that beef so that everyone in America can have several hamburgers a day or a week. We often focus on the beef end of that, but not the plowing up of prairie or raising the forests or the jungle to grow those soybeans and that corn. Most of it's all coming from South America at this point, and because of global trade, those same soybeans are going to China or going to Italy or coming to the United States, and we're also growing some here, but we have used up a lot of our land in this country for growing this stuff. And we're volatilizing carbon from the soil, so there's a really important link between this kind of intensive agriculture and climate change, which also is not something that we talk about often enough or at all. Plus all of the chemical fertilizers, the petroleum-based fertilizers, the incredible amount of gas and waste oil that's used to produce one GMO crop. It's mind-boggling, not to mention the polluting of all the tractors and hovering trucks and everything else involved in growing that one crop. I think that some of the things that shocked me that some of the scientists were saying as I was researching this book were things like, we will kill everything in the ecosystem, or we are the ultimate animal study. I was heartbroken the whole time I was working on it that somehow Rachel Carson had published her book in 1962, and then rereading it. I reread the book several times while I was working on my book, and I just couldn't believe that nothing had changed other than banning DDT. The same chemicals she's writing about, 2,4,5-T, for instance, we're still using it. In fact, we're modifying crops to be sprayed with this. And 2,4-D, I mean, it was very hard for me as a mother of children to realize how broken our regulatory process was, and how we've had blinders on and we've been letting this happen. So what's the upside? I don't know that I can necessarily give you one, except that I found it really fascinating to do this work. Have any of you ever driven across the Midwest of this country or the Great Plains and seen Iowa and seen where a lot of our food is grown? It's amazing. So, wetlands, sloughs, everything, they've all been filled in to grow corn. Michael Pollan astutely called them corn cities. It comes right up to the side of the road. It's everywhere. Farms have been, family farms have been dismantled in favor of just growing corn. Families have sold all the land up to their doorstep to these big ag companies. There are test plots, so you see little signs everywhere, and it'll have the name of a big ag company like Syngenta or Monsanto or Bayer or whomever. And these test plots, they're testing right out in the open air there, all kinds of different chemicals or products, like a genetically modified seed that needs a specific chemical. One of the things to keep in mind about GMOs, and this is really where my book went, was I became less concerned about the GMO, which is just a buzzword really. Of course, I was interested in the pesticidal action of the GMO, the fact that the GMO contains internally its own pesticide, but I was much more concerned about the pesticides that go with them, and the fact that it was this amazing closed loop that the chemical companies had come up with. The great people who made Agent Orange also brought us these products. And what was fascinating and scary to me was that, they were making a product for which you had to have their chemical to spray on it to make it work. So, and then when Bayer and Monsanto merged, of course, then they're also making the medicines for when we get cancer. I'm sure many of you are aware, or if you're not, you should Google it, that there's an enormous lawsuit going on right now suing Monsanto for the cancer-causing properties of glyphosate, which is Roundup. Roundup causes non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and there's an incredibly clear causal link, and farmers have been getting sick, and yet somehow we continue to spray it with reckless abandon. Depending on who you ask, since the advent of the GMO, our pesticide use, or our herbicide use, forget the other pesticides, right? Fungicides, pesticides that kill bugs, but just our herbicide use has either gone up 21% or 46%. That's the exact opposite of what the promise was. The promise was that with the advent of the GMO, because it carries its own pesticide inside, that we would actually use less. And that's not what's happened at all. So, driving across Iowa, I was just amazed by these test plots and the fact that things were out in the open air, that over here would be GMO plants. Over here would be a farmer growing non-GMO, I guess. And over here, with very little buffer zone, would maybe be some organic being grown. These things are out in the open air. When you do these test plots of these products that have never hit the market before, some of them are just for animal feed, some of them are for human consumption. No one's talking about I can imagine somebody's thinking about it, but no one's talking about the fact that, well, we've forgotten birds, butterflies, bees, chipmunks, hawks, whatever, that are going to come down and, move some of those seeds, or collect a little bit of the pesticide and take it to the next crop. And this is why people who are studying food right now know that there's nothing that's clean. No food, even if it's organic, is totally clean. And in fact, Carrie Gillum is here, and she's going to read from her book, Whitewash, maybe, I think, later today. And she'll talk about that even more extensively, I think. But she did some great reporting on this. But this is a crisis for not just us and our children, but also for all of the voiceless creatures out there that are being affected by what we've done. What else can I tell you? The book came out 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, and since then I've gone on to new things. I'm working on a novel and some poetry. And part of the reason for that was I just felt incredibly deep fatigue after Trump was elected, and I had been on the road with this book for several months and working on it for as many months as I had. How to keep talking about these issues, how to keep trying to educate people in a culture where it sometimes feels like it almost doesn't matter. That was the fatigue that I felt. But it's inspiring when people, like last night, I was really inspired by the climate panel, and I think that lots of people are working hard on these issues. In my home state of Maine, we've just elected Janet Mills, who's our first female governor. Her number one, her first thing on the agenda is climate change. She's trying to learn. She's very interested in farming. I just wrote a piece about her for the New York Times, in fact. And she's interested in learning from everybody. I mean, just even on the phone with me on Sunday when I interviewed her, she was asking me about laundry soap. Suddenly she was interviewing me, and she went into her laundry room at the governor's mansion and was saying, is this okay? Is this okay to use? So that was really cool, to have somebody who's open and wants to learn. And there's an old adage in Maine, as Maine goes, so goes the nation. So one can hope. But I loved learning everything I learned, and I learned so many things about bees and about how delicate their systems are, how they get pesticides from. There are these little guttation drops, which are like little bits of mist or dew on plants in the morning, which scientists have found have pesticides in them. But that's what bees drink. That's the water that they drink. The different ways that pesticides are delivered to them, how they affect their little bodies, how disoriented they are becoming from the overabundance of neonicotinoids. How interestingly enough, some pesticides, bees do better if they're constantly given antibiotics. But there's a problem in that, right? They can resist some of the chemical breakdown that happens to their guts if they are taking antibiotics all the time. So it was really fascinating work, and I had a great time doing it. I have no idea where the clock is that I'm supposed to be paying attention to. Where is it? Where is it? On my feet, somewhere here. Maybe what we should do is, I'm not tall enough to see. So maybe what we should do is open this up to you, and if you want, we could do kind of a hybrid here where you ask some questions and I try to answer them. Maybe I could read you a little passage from the book if you want to hear more reading and that doesn't lull you too far into sleep. And we can go from there. A collaborative conversation would be great for me, and you're welcome to ask me about anything. From my other writing to this writing. I'm sort of an omnivore. I write all different kinds of things. I'm not an activist. I'm a person who gets attached to a story. I mean, last year I had a piece in the Times about John Updike and my time working at the New Yorker on a sexual harassment thing that happened to me there. So I'm never just on one topic. I'm on lots of different things all the time, and I'm happy to talk about any and all of them. I try to report things when I'm reporting from a very honest middle ground, and to ask the same tough questions of people who maybe I don't ethically agree with to people who I do. And I think that's really important to do. So if any of you has a question, let me know. I'd love to answer it. And do the question people need mic? Okay, great.
Hello. The Swiss Federal Health Ministry released a study in 2013 which said that 92% of the toxins in our food are in the animal foods, and of the 92, 54 is in dairy. So there's a lot of vegan, vegetarian people here. So they're what I just learned from you and from other people, avoiding like animal foods, including honey, is actually beneficial for our health, or helps at least a little bit. I mean, you cannot escape the toxic rain and the plastic in even good soil that you buy. It's right. Filled with little pieces of plastic.
Yeah, so I mean, these are things. So again, 1962, Rachel Carson wrote about this very issue. Why didn't anyone pay attention? I don't know. But so pesticides are stored in the fatty tissue. So in dairy and meat, which we eat, you'll have a much more, in fact, you'll get it in a much more concentrated way than the cow actually, their body experienced, because it was sort of, the pesticides were distributed more evenly throughout their body. But if you eat non-organic dairy or meat, you're going to get a much larger pesticidal wallop because all of it gets stored in that fat and sequestered in the cow's fat. So that's something important to consider. If there's one thing you're going to eat organically and you're not a vegan, then you should eat meat and dairy organically. There are all kinds of other problems with meat and dairy, as we've discussed, or other people have discussed. For me, it really became not an issue of vegan, non-vegan, vegetarian, GMO, non-GMO. I don't really care if something's GMO or not, because that does not tell me whether or not it's been sprayed with atrazine, for instance, which is a pesticide which is causing, one of the scientists that I wrote about in my book was a guy named Tyrone Hayes, who stood up to one of the big ag companies. He's at UC Berkeley, called Syngenta, and they followed him and threatened him and threatened his family for years. He's also a black man in a predominantly white male world, but he was attacked a ton, and the reason is that he was studying how. First, he was doing it for Syngenta, and then he refused to not publish his findings, and that began a whole lawsuit between himself and Syngenta. But he found that atrazine, which is an herbicide, was causing gender confusion and gender changes in male frogs. So this actually. Some of this work has gone on to look at boys in the Northwest that are that are being born in areas of high atrazine spraying, who are having genital malformations when they're born, lowered sperm counts eventually, small penises, no testicles, hermaphrodites. So, but he was one of the early people studying frogs in sloughs all across the Midwest, and studying how they were sometimes being born with both female and male parts, how they were often confused about what gender they were. They essentially were mating with other males. They were they were essentially gay because they were confused and they didn't know how to procreate with females. This has enormous implications for our society. So, and he posited, and this made a lot of people mad, that perhaps some of the gender confusions or that some young children have could be related to pesticidal overload. So where am I going with that? Yeah, the pesticides. So it became less important to me whether one was vegan or vegetarian or whether it was GMO or non-GMO. The issue was you don't want pesticides. Now, is it a perfect world? Absolutely not, because we're going to get some pesticides everywhere. That's just the world we live in. So if it isn't organic, you're going to get pesticides. The non-GMO label in the end meant nothing to me. And I believe it means nothing. It doesn't, just because you fed an animal non-GMO feed, they're still getting a lot of other stuff. Anybody else? Yeah. How about you? The red hair. Yeah. I can't hear you. Yeah.
I worked on an organic farm in the 70s, and if you didn't spray for 2 years, then you were considered an organic farm. And also, they didn't have enough USDA agents to certify that it was organic. And that's still going on, where they hire their own agents who sign off. And I've also seen in a shopping where they sell fruits and vegetables, and put the non-organic with the expensive organic, just throw them right in. So I don't think they do that at like Jandy's. That's like a reputable place. So know where you're going, compare notes with your friends or with a local vegetarian group. I grow my own. I get seaweed from the beach. But I realize, I tell everybody, you can't say it's organic. The bees, go from the next garden that they spray in, and they come to your garden. So just do your best. I mean, a lot of us grew up on hot dogs, Kool-Aid, sugary cereal, and now we're trying to, change our ways. And, you only can do the best you can. Like you say, I don't trust that non-GMO label either.
Right. Actually, you bring up a really good point, which is the regulatory issue and whether or not they have enough staff. So if you guys are up for it, maybe I'll read you a couple of pages about that very issue from Modified. Does that sound like something you might be interested in? Okay. So this is about a phone call that I had with a guy named Bruce Chassie. Now you should, so one of the ways I got into writing this book, I'll tell you guys that I was pregnant with my second child when I started writing it. So what kind of a person takes on a major book about science and then decides to get pregnant with a second child at the same time and only gives herself 6 months to write the book? So I had to start the book. My deadline for having all my research done was April of, 2014. And at that point, around that exact same week that I was supposed to start writing, I was extremely nauseous, so nauseous that I would be sitting at my table and there would be research on another table, and I felt like I could not get up and go get it. But one of the ways that I made the book fun for myself, as I sat there and thought, oh God, this is going to be deadly. No one wants to read a book about GMOs, not even me, was that I made footnotes. And so I was able to kind of be myself in footnotes and talk about other things that were going on, either with the people I was writing about. So Bruce Chassie, he's somebody that if you were to Google him or to read my footnotes, the New York Times did Eric Lipton for the New York Times did a huge investigation of him while I was working on the book, actually. That ended up, I was already done, actually, and we were in the midst of the legal and fact-checking. But I was able to get it in as a footnote, that he had been paid off by Monsanto. But so that's sort of a backdrop, because now, the book has come out and all this other information has come out about him. But here we go. So this is early on in the book when I was driving across the Great Plains and interviewing Monsanto people. Are you calling me a whore? Bruce Chassie, a retired university scientist whose pro-GMO lobbying efforts were or are funded perhaps indirectly by Monsanto, bellowed into the phone. He was speaking to me from his home, nestled high in the mountains of Idaho. No, I said, shocked. I wouldn't use that word. I was scrambling. The Annie Hall type subtitles moving across the screen went like this. Wow, extreme reaction. I really pissed him off. How can I recover this? Fuck. He went on, outraged. Soon, outrage boiled down to a low simmer of indignation, but he kept talking, and I kept listening. Earlier that spring, after someone had told me that Bruce is a retired plant biologist from the University of Illinois who had also become a consultant for Monsanto, I'd emailed him. Bruce also along the way got a Fulbright to go to Spain, did research for the National Institutes of Health, and is now a professor emeritus of food safety and nutritional scientists at the University of Illinois. In short, this guy is no slouch. Bruce is helping Monsanto, he told me, essentially clean up their image. Because, in his words, I think they mishandled the public relations of GM crops terribly. They had an arrogance about how good their product was, and a total lack of understanding of the concern. He says he does this not for pay, but because he believes in biotechnology and what it has to offer the planet. When I finally got Bruce on the phone, it was sometime after dinner on a cool, damp spring evening. Dan was putting our son to bed, and it was dark out. The maple tree outside my office window, where a red-eyed vireo was making a nest with strands of dried grass, dryer lint, bits of wasp nests, and some of Hopper's fur from when we brushed him outside, was fluttering its leaves gently in the evening breeze. Our house, one of a handful that comprised a small village center in the quintessential New England river town of New Gloucester, Maine, was a quiet, quaint clapboard and stone foundation structure with big windows and matching drafts that belonged to a friend who had moved down south. He had offered his house to us after the ceiling had caved in our Portland rental apartment due to a roof leak, making it uninhabitable. In a flurry, we put all our things in storage and landed 30 minutes north of Portland, suddenly surrounded by farms, apple trees, and pumpkin fields. The house was both hilarious in its disrepair and also wonderfully charming in certain corners where the light came in pools, illuminating old wood floors and dark molding. We loved the big yard, the 3 enormous sugar maples, and the snake family that lived in the old barn foundation. In March, we tapped the maples and made our own syrup, and in the spring, we were ecstatic to behold each wave of blooming crocuses, daffodils, tulips, and irises. Bruce is the kind of guy who jumps full throttle into a conversation, as if you've been talking for hours already, leaving little dead space, and even less space for questions. His tone isn't exactly friendly either. Underneath the information he pelts you with is a seething quality, which is hard not to notice. First, he wanted to start with some historical background, which he felt I needed, and I heartily agreed. According to Bruce, back when plant genetic engineering looked like it was going to be possible, the industry went to the White House, Bush Sr., and said it might be worthwhile to look at this new technology to see whether it would need to be regulated or not. He said that after some careful review, the National Academy of Sciences concluded that genetic engineering was rapid, simple, and precise, and therefore needed little oversight. From a science perspective, he said, we shouldn't have even had to talk about this. A debate wasn't necessary, and the public didn't really need to be involved. So the government said, go for it. Furthermore, he went on, for any GMO on the market, they've probably been working on it for 10 years in the lab, and from development to approval is probably 10 to 15 years. So there was ample time for the company to find any problems. So you remember, in those 10 to 15 years, as I was saying earlier, it's out in the open air where they're testing it. They aren't just testing it in a hermetically sealed environment, in a lab, in a greenhouse. These test plots are all out there for anything to come in contact with them. He went on to elucidate for me that any testing that's done on a GMO is done by the company themselves, never by the FDA, EPA, or USDA. This was news to me. But he said this was a good thing because it's actually safer when the developer, like Monsanto or Dow or whoever is making the product, produces their data, testing it for environmental and health risks from start to finish. The feds, he told me, this is what sort of brings me to your question, the feds, he told me, don't have the facility or the scientists to test it. When I asked him if he believes that companies are indeed transparent with their data on products they stand to make money from, or if it's really in their best interest to be transparent, he retorted, it's a crime to withhold data. And furthermore, all those tests are available, and they, the USDA, FDA, EPA, can walk in at any time to ask to see the books. They do that less and less, and less than 1% of the time because they don't have the staff. What did he mean? The USDA or the FDA or the EPA just simply does not have the staff to evaluate the data from the companies developing GMOs, I asked. He told me that for any given product, a company would have to back up 2 tractor-trailer trucks of data, and nobody would go through it. But the salient point, he said, was that the one that Americans need to realize is that no company is misrepresenting what they've done. Bruce started to get irritated, I realized in hindsight, when, for reasons I wasn't sure about, he took a 180 and veered our conversation toward the anti-GMO activist groups. He especially wanted to talk about the DC-based watchdog group called the Center for Food Safety, whom he dismisses as a special interest group that is wasting our time while they make a lot of money, scaring the public about GMOs. Furthermore, he said the people opposed to GM are cheats and liars. Well, I asked, can you tell me how the regular food-buying American people might get the right information about GMOs if not from those special interest groups? He said, asking the public to make judgments on things they don't know anything about makes no sense. This is highly technical stuff and really hard to understand. But shouldn't the people be given information in a manner they can understand? I wanted to know. Can it be broken down so that the regular parents, like me, can make an informed decision on the subject? Bruce gave a tight, annoyed chuckle. And ultimately, he said, it comes down to this. Trust is the issue. When modified plants and animals are patented, he said, you achieve transparency. Therefore, the public should just trust the companies that have created them. Because they have patented the product, I asked? He was getting annoyed by my ignorance. He sighed. People at the companies are the most ethical people I know, he went on. I have less respect for university scientists than I do for industry scientists. It's much more important for a company scientist to be more honest than a university scientist. This was an odd thing to say, given he'd spent much of his own career as a university scientist, but I said okay and let it drop. I didn't want to push it. We talked a little more, but it didn't feel like we were getting any further, as he was kind of done with me. So I said thank you, and we hung up. I made my way downstairs to the dark kitchen at the back of the old New Gloucester house. Dan was sweeping the floor. The dishes were drying in the rack. What kind of a silly wild goose chase was I on, anyway? If it was true that the companies were doing copious amounts of testing of their products, even though the public couldn't see any of those tests, it didn't mean they hadn't happened, right? I was suddenly inspired by Bruce's exasperated confidence, all fired up about those hysterical watchdog groups out there screaming about the boogeyman in order to make money. Dan, I said, this guy I just talked to you was so convincing, so assured about GMOs and their safety. I've really started to wonder. That's your story, said Dan, the gray area, the people who are making sense on both sides, the nuance in the middle. I suppose, I said, my mind whirling. But as I stood there watching Dan push a small pile of dirt and dinner detritus into the dustpan with the end of the broom, I found myself going back through the conversation with Bruce. Frozen in thought while Dan cleaned, I was wondering what Bruce gained from his position, because everyone stands to gain something, I figure, even this writer, from the stance they take. Emboldened, I decided to call him back and ask him point blank, what exactly is in it for you, working for Monsanto? Do you get a paycheck? Is your background in science ever compromised? How do I trust what you're telling me about the ethical actions of the people at Monsanto? There was a second of silence, and then the onslaught began. I resent the implication that I'd lie and cheat and whore for the job. You can't buy people. We're university scientists. Hoping to change the subject, I quickly asked Bruce if he was interested in talking about Simon Hogan's study. This is another scientist in my book who found disturbances in mice from not feeding them, inserting GMO meal into their respiratory tracts. It's kind of complicated, but Simon I break it down so it's not so complicated, but it's in the book. Which was becoming a bellwether of sorts for those who I was talking to. I was learning that it helped me root out where an interviewee's ideology on GMOs lay. Not that Bruce's ideology was unclear at this point, but I was still hungry for more information from either side that could leave me with a clear understanding I could parlay into a strong thesis statement. GMOs are bad, or GMOs are okay. I felt open to inconvenient truths, even if they were just inconvenient to myself. I still wanted to vet out whether I could really pin my own health recovery on the lack of GMOs in my diet. Bruce huffed some more, but did not hang up, and though grumbling and clearly put off, he dismissed Simon's study by saying, "It was one study. And most of the allergists I know were unconvinced. It was a false positive in an inappropriate study. The people who used that study are not interested in science and not interested in the truth." Was there any merit at all to the study, I asked? He sighed. The P proves that GM crops could be allergenic. Means that that particular crop was allergenic. Bingo. But he went on, "It was a lousy experiment. The animal model system has never been used before and wasn't accepted, and it wasn't truly a food allergy. It was actually a respiratory allergy, and the scientific community was not willing to accept that conclusion." He told me about a redo of the study in Europe where they could not replicate Hogan's results. What did this prove, I wondered? The P is a dead issue. The science is settled. To the media, one paper is news. To the scientific community, one paper is nothing. It was only later that the irony of what he said about being a university scientist occurred to me. And it was only really ironic when viewed from the safety of home, with Hopper there to protect me. We always said, to quote Elizabeth Bishop, that Hop was safe as houses. This was our dog. Just like when I looked up Bruce on Facebook and saw an image of a bearded guy holding a guitar and sitting in front of an impressive backdrop of shimmering mountains, distance, in this case, was everything. But here I was, 6 months later, for better or for worse, right in the middle of GMO country, driving myself deeper into the story and the controversy. If off-the-record conversations, some unpleasant phone calls, and a handful of scary anecdotes had put me over the edge back home in Maine, why in the world had I stupidly gotten on a plane to ask for more? Should I really dance in the eye of this hurricane, I wondered? To keep going rather than turn my car around and just head back to Denver, which seemed like a really nice town right about now. I had to put my head down and suspend all thought. I tuned the iPod to Ryan Adams and let him carry me for the next 80-something miles. So it's a long diversion into what the regulatory issue and the fact that there's no staff and there's nobody overseeing this. So it's a free-for-all. Anybody else have anything they'd like to? Now I need to stand on my tippy toes to see the time. How about you with the hat?
Holding the mic. I am still holding the mic.
Oh, you're next. Okay.
Can I have a minute?
Of course.
I just wanted to respond to this oppressiveness and wanted to just mention that so many people around the globe are waking up to being conscious, being co-responsible of what we do to the planet, what we do to our bodies. That's why we can have this beautiful conference. That's why 80,000 people signed up on YouTube to be part of and listen to you. And I just want to announce that humanity has done so many things that are very counterproductive to our health over history that we could get many examples of. And here is another era with many very destructive elements. But let's just look that Europe has decided to dismantle all nuclear plants. And, the pesticide issues are next. So
one can hope, yeah. I think that, I have to say, I feel like even in the 2 years and few months since this book came out, things have changed. I feel a little more hopeful. As I said, when I started this, I sort of slid into a really deep funk after Trump was elected, and I had been going around the country talking about this book. In fact, it was an interesting moment. Trump was elected, and that night, like many people, I did not sleep. And the very next morning, I had to go to Yale to give a speech at Yale. And that was probably one of the most dangerous drives I've ever done in my life. I was exhausted, and I left too late because I was so slow getting organized, and I was in such shock. Anyway, I got down there, and I just remember feeling so defeated. And then there were these biotech people that came to my talk and tried to sort of disrupt it. And I asked them to leave. I just, something snapped in me, and I was done. And I just said, "That's it, you're done. You're out. There's the door." And I was so seething, and that was a breaking point for me. But I will say that I feel like in the last couple of years, and I think, just in the last couple of months, actually, since my state, elected Janet Mills as our governor, post Susan Collins supporting Brett Kavanaugh and Trump in the White House. And we had an absolutely horrible governor, Paul LePage, who was a national embarrassment. I feel there's this little window, and she's putting together these great people who are working on these issues. I think maybe I don't know what we can do and how much we can roll back, but there are little glimmers. I agree. Next person. You in the hat.
Thank you so much. I have two questions. One about nitrogen in the water on Long Island, and also atrazine in the water on Long Island. So
on your land?
On this island, Long Island.
In the land?
Yes.
Yes.
And I talked to the DEC at a conference the other day, and I said, 20 years ago I saw atrazine in the water table, and it's still there. How come it's not banned?
Right.
He says to me, well, you're taking the tool out of the toolbox. That's what it is.
What?
You're taking his tool out of the toolbox, the guy being the sprayer,
Right.
So I don't understand that, and I was wondering about, the atrazine in the water and what you have to think about it. And nitrogen, too.
Yeah, so the chemicals that are chemical fertilizers, the nitrogen, stuff like that, and the atrazine, all pesticides, I write extensively about water samples that the Geological Survey and various scientists are making across the Midwest and testing, rain coming from clouds and all that stuff. Yeah, we have saturated the earth with really dangerous toxins. Here's a good example. So, Agent Orange is made of two chemicals, 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T. When you put them together, it makes Agent Orange, both of which are carcinogens in different ways. People are still suffering in Vietnam from the fact that the soil is still contaminated with these chemicals. So 2,4,5-T, for instance, is a chemical that was banned for use in this country, a pesticide. However, we've still been making it in this country. Monsanto was still making it in Nitro, West Virginia. There was a huge settlement just a couple years ago because the town became so contaminated with a chemical which we have banned in our own country, and yet we're shipping to third world countries to use as a pesticide. 2,4-D, we have made now 2,4-D resistant crops because Roundup is no longer working. Atrazine is no longer working. So I don't know what to say to you except that, I spend a lot of my days trying to not go to the mentality that we're just totally fucked, basically. So, yeah, it's everywhere. There was someone back here who wanted to ask, yeah.
Thank you for all your work and your research on this. I'm curious to hear more about your access to these large the agribusiness giants and how you were able to have access to people and how some of your conversations went specifically when you were talking to people at, say, Monsanto and still there. That's
a great question. There's a lot more about that in the book. There's a lot of, there's a lot about that and a lot about the vulnerability I felt as a woman. And I don't want to tell this whole story right now because it would take a while, but there was one moment where I was physically threatened a little bit when I was driving across the Great Plains, or I felt physically threatened. That was scary. But access, I'm an incredible pain in the ass. That's the first thing. So, and I'm lucky enough to have some credentials behind me. I've written for the New York Times. I've written for big magazines. I was brought up to believe that I could, eat dinner with the Queen of England or with the President of the United States or hang with peasants in Mexico. My parents taught me all of that. So it never occurred to me that I shouldn't be able to talk to someone I wanted to talk to. So what is the Zora Neale Hurston says in Their Eyes Are Watching God, ships at a distance have every man's wish on board. For some, they sail forever on the horizon. For others, they come in with the tide. Now, for women, the dream is the truth, and then they act and do things accordingly. Now, it's a great quote for these days, right? But I just, why wouldn't these people talk to me? I'm smart, can be charming. I have a couple of good questions, and if they hang up on me, I'm just going to call them back, or I'm going to write about them hanging up on me. So I guess access is how dogged you are, for one. And for two, I think because I had some credentials behind me and because I never occurred to me that they shouldn't talk to me, I just went for it. Now, the people at Monsanto were very difficult. They tried to make it really hard for me. And they tried to, for instance, my book came out and I did an ABC radio tour. Books come out on Tuesdays in general. I did for 2 days of an ABC radio tour where essentially I was in my yoga pants at home on the phone all day long, being patched into different radio stations around the country, mainstream radio stations. And it was really interesting. It was all guys who were talking to me generally. And they were like talking about sports and cars and stuff. And then these were radio stations owned by ABC. And then they would do this interview with me. But every single one of these guys, before they would interview me on the air, they wanted to talk to me either before or afterwards about their own health and their own fears and what they were seeing in the environment. They wanted answers. They were all very vulnerable. And that was so fascinating to me because I thought going into this is going to stink. Like they're going to give me a really hard time. But 2 days after doing those interviews, I disappeared from my publisher is Penguin Random House. And I disappeared completely from the Penguin Random House website, vanished. Gone. It had been hacked and I had disappeared. The Monsanto people didn't really want to talk to me. They made it really difficult. And so I would find a workaround. I'd find somebody else who was no longer working for them but was working at a university, say, or I would just keep calling, or I would find somebody who knew somebody else who could put me in touch with someone. I just dogged, and taking my time. I took my time. Remember, my husband was working several jobs at the time. I was also a mom. There was a lot of time for things to spin and me to figure out what's happening here. And there were even scientists who were fighting the good fight, who sometimes I thought weren't telling me the entire truth about things. And I would realize that. There's a moment in the book where I realized that there's a scientist who hasn't actually told me the full story of what had happened to him. He had been threatened. And then I went back to him to find out more. So, great question. All I can say is just, I kept knocking down doors, and whether I'm dealing with, I've just always been this way. I'm a pain in the ass. And I don't think anyone who I interviewed will tell you any differently. I think they all thought I was a pain. Anybody else? Any other questions? Yeah.
This thing on? Yes, it is. So can you elaborate how you were physically threatened?
That's a long section of the book, but essentially I was in Nebraska, and a scientist who worked for Monsanto, who I had not portrayed in a positive light in my piece that went viral that I wrote for Elle, intimated that I might be kidnapped, and that was very scary to me. So, but the whole story is in the book. It's just and I don't know if I overreacted. I'm pretty honest about that. I'm honest about everything in the book. It's really like it's very much a personal memoir, journey, food, travelogue. It's a really fun book to read, actually, even though it's about GMOs, which by itself could not be a more stultifying topic. Anybody else? Did you have your hand up? No. Okay. No other questions? Comments? Thoughts? Yes.
Do you have suggestions for those listening online where they can join efforts to grow more organic or be more involved in this whole cleaning up our act in terms of pesticides and
Absolutely. I
plastics?
mean, so eat organic, easier said than done. Do the best you can. Buy local. Have tough conversations with your farmers. Here's an example. Where I live in Maine, I grow food in our garden, sometimes more successfully than at other times. I belong to a CSA. We source most of our food. Like in the book, I really do go through how we made a transformation as a family to sourcing almost all of our food locally and organically. I have recipes in the book and things that I talk about canning and all those different things that we started doing. And what I can tell you is that it's not always easy. So where I live, we have lots of farmers markets, lots of access to farmers. There's a farmer whose cheese I really like. We actually buy their organic eggs, but they don't feed their cows organic feed. They feed them non-GMO feed. I really want to eat their cheese. Their blue cheese is so good. It's the best blue cheese around, but we don't buy it because what I know about pesticides going into the fats. But I had a very frank conversation with them and told them why I wouldn't be buying it. And when every so often I ask them if they've transitioned their cows yet to organic feed, and they tell me the reasons they haven't, and it's always awkward, and then we still don't buy the blue cheese. Is it fun to do that about everything? Is it fun to be an investigative reporter about your food, your shampoo, your personal hygiene products? It's a lot of effort. It's a lot of work, and sometimes we all fall flat on our faces. But we do the best we can. We do the best we can. And really, honestly, someone said this last night. We can't actually solve any of these problems until we solve the climate issue. Unfortunately, the climate issue is tied to a lot of these other problems, right? But so if we get rid of one thing, we may actually start to solve the climate issue. But it has to be a coalesced, intense effort to ban pesticides, to change this intensive agriculture, to let some of the prairie go back to being prairie in this country. To reclaim jungle for the animals and the trees and the insects and everything. So we don't need all this. I mean, what's really fascinating when I was researching this book, one of the things that just shocked me was that since the advent of the GMO, actually the number of food insecure people on the planet has gone up. So the two promises: we're going to use less pesticides and we're going to feed more people. Well, both of those have failed. We're using far more pesticides, and the number of food insecure people has risen steadily on the same chart as the GMO has been used with its use going up. This has to be stopped, and we will also start to address the climate issue in that way. But it's a chicken or egg kind of thing. Right now, we have to deal with the climate, and we have to deal with how we are polluting the planet at the same time as we do that. Anybody else? I think I have a few more minutes. Yeah. I filter our water. We filter our water. What? Well, it depends on the filter you have. I use something called the Berkey, Berkey, which is a big stainless steel thing that sits on your counter. My mother actually bought it for me when I was living in Los Angeles, and which has some of the worst water in the country as far as pesticides and other pollutants in the water. And it's a big stainless steel thing that sits on your counter, and you pour your water in, and it has carbon filters. Water is a really big issue. So, but supposedly a lot of pesticides do get filtered out from carbon. Actually, water is really fascinating, and that was what I was going to write about next, but decided that I just didn't want to be out there in the field. My youngest son was 2 when this book came out, and I just didn't want to do another big topic, which is why I went to a novel that I've been carrying the idea around since 1998, believe it or not. But water is a huge topic. It's how to filter it, the plastics involved with filtering systems, the different stuff involved in softening water, big industrial filtering systems for cities, lakes and ponds that water comes from. It's really fascinating fascinating and terrifying once you start to try to look at solutions and look for solutions for how are we going to keep water clean, and how are we going to have enough water for the whole planet?
Thank you.
I saw somebody else's hand. Yeah.
Is it accurate that organic refers to the growing process, and that they put pesticides on the produce after it's harvested to protect it from insects and such en route while it's being transported?
Uh-huh.
Is that accurate? Is that true?
Well, I mean, probably. I mean, so a lot of food gets all kinds of different stuff on it. They get waxes, they get a food grade wax or a sort of oil or a gel sometimes put on them. I'm assuming there are pesticides, at least in the trucks, for sure. The trucks are sprayed down, I'm sure. I don't know about organic. I think there are specific rules for organic. But that's a great question. I don't know that much about spraying down produce post-pick, but I've always assumed that there have got to be pesticides in the trucks and stuff to make sure that they don't get contaminated with bugs. Yeah.
Well, what is the best way to wash them off?
You can't wash off most pesticides.
Even veggie wash and all these kind of things?
No. It's so a lot of these things are systemic, and they are taken into the flesh, as water.
Into the flesh of the plants.
The flesh of the plants, yeah. So most pesticides are systemic. Neonicotinoids are systemic. It's a neurotoxin, and it's systemic, and that's one of the ones that's affecting the bees. Glyphosate, Roundup, is a systemic pesticide, also taken in by the plant, by its roots, and funneled up through the hole into the fruit and the stalk and the leaves and everything. And then that's why, so when the plant sweats a little bit and there's a little bit of what they call these guttation drops, and that's what the bees drink in the morning, that's their water, that's why that's one way that they come in contact with pesticides. Anybody else? No? Are we done? Terrific. If you'd like to buy a book, I'd be happy to sign them. Thanks.